Before anything else, I need you to understand this: what you're about to hear isn't tabloid speculation or internet gossip. This isn't clickbait. This is the actual courtroom testimony, word for word, as reported from inside the federal trial of Sean Diddy Combs. And it isn't just explosive, it's historic. Viewer discretion isn't just advised, it's essential. Because when Justin Bieber walked into that courtroom, the air changed. Not because of who he is, but because of what he was carrying. This wasn't a pop star seeking headlines. This was a man whose silence had become a burden, and whose testimony, unexpected, unscripted, was so staggering that it shattered the composure of one of the most powerful men in entertainment. The day had started like any other in the trial. Lawyers reviewed notes, the press jostled for front row seats, and Diddy sat with his usual guarded detachment, glancing occasionally at his legal team. No one expected the doors to swing open and reveal Justin Bieber, dressed simply, no entourage, no flash, just a determined face, and eyes that told you he hadn't slept in days. When his name was read aloud, a gasp swept the room. Even the judge raised an eyebrow. Diddy, who had up until then appeared unshaken by testimony after testimony, suddenly sat rigid, papers slipping from his hand. No one was prepared for what was coming, not the lawyers, not the press, not even the defense. Justin stepped forward slowly, as if walking through years of fear and regret, and when he took the stand, he didn't pause. "I'm not here as a celebrity," he began, his voice clear but heavy. "I'm here because I stayed silent for too long. And I can't do that anymore." You could feel the shift. The courtroom wasn't just listening, it was holding its breath. He started from the beginning. 15 years old, new to fame, new to everything. A Canadian teenager thrown into the machine. Diddy had found him early, offered him what every young artist dreams of: protection, guidance, access. At first, Justin said, he thought it was mentorship. "But I was being shaped," he said. "Groomed. I didn't know it then. I do now." He talked about the parties, the secrecy, how phones were confiscated, how security was tighter than anything he'd ever seen. It didn't feel like privacy, he said. It felt like control. Then he talked about Cassie. About the bruises he noticed, the silences that stretched too long, the look in her eyes when Diddy was near. She wasn't free, he said. She was owned. And that word, owned, hung in the room like smoke. Justin described moments that would haunt anyone: a whispered plea from Cassie after a party, "Please don't say anything. It'll just make it worse." He said that moment broke something in him. But he didn't speak. He was too young. Too afraid. Too controlled. "I told myself I'd help her later," he said, eyes wet. But there was always a later. And she kept suffering. He described being invited to Diddy's private studio, thinking it was to hear music, only to find walls lined with monitors. Footage. Guests. Celebrities. Some half-dressed. Some crying. He watched people like they were his property, Justin said. He smiled when they flinched. He smiled when they obeyed. Then came the threats. Anonymous calls. Videos from the past. Things I didn't even remember, he admitted. But they were real. And they were damning. One day, his manager received a package. Inside was a USB. It showed a teenage Justin, clearly intoxicated, saying things he didn't remember, things that could ruin a career. The voice behind the camera? Diddy. "This is what happens when you forget who your friends are," it said. Justin paused. "He was reminding me who owned me too." He said he began to retreat. Declining parties. Dodging events. But then the retribution began. Radio stations stopped playing his songs. Rumors swirled: mental health, ungratefulness, arrogance. None of it was true, he said. It was all designed to isolate me. To punish me. Then he got the call: someone told him more footage exists. And it's coming. That was when he started connecting the dots. The bruises. The parties. The secrecy. The whispers. The fear. I realized I had been part of something vile. And by staying silent, I had let it continue. That night, he called prosecutors himself. Told them he was ready. "Whatever you need," he said. "I'll give it. I won't protect him anymore." And then, in that courtroom, he did something no one expected. He pulled a small USB from his coat pocket. "This contains surveillance footage," he said. "Footage my team legally obtained. Footage from inside his homes." The silence in the room was so thick it felt physical. He handed it to the clerk. "I used to be afraid. But I have a child now. And I want my kid to grow up knowing I stood for something." Then he turned to Cassie, seated in the gallery, and his voice broke. "You didn't deserve any of it. I saw what he did to you. I'm sorry I didn't speak sooner." Diddy, who had sat still until now, suddenly dropped his head into his hands. His shoulders shook. Tears streamed silently. The courtroom watched in disbelief. The man who had ruled with power, undone by truth. Justin didn't blink. "You told me loyalty was everything," he said. "Well, I'm loyal to the truth. Now." And as he walked out of the courtroom, no press, no wave, no smile, just quiet resolution, the industry trembled. PR firms scrambled. Executives panicked. Former allies vanished. Labels held emergency meetings. Because this wasn't just testimony. It was the start of a reckoning. The system that protected Diddy, silent no more. The era of fear was ending. The truth was louder now. And yet even as Justin exited that courtroom without a glance backward, his words still echoed inside every wall of that building, reverberating through the hearts of jurors, reporters, and spectators alike. Outside, the wind cut sharply through the streets of Manhattan, but it couldn't drown out the sound of silence that followed him, a silence that wasn't empty, but filled with shock, awe, and a sudden unraveling of decades of untouchable power. Inside, Diddy still hadn't lifted his face. The tears hadn't stopped. His lawyer leaned in, whispering something, but the man who once ruled with confidence and charisma looked hollowed out, broken, like a man whose kingdom had been torched in front of him. But this wasn't about a single fall from grace. This was about the entire structure behind it, the network of fear and silence, the culture of complicity that had allowed such things to flourish under the glow of flashing lights and red carpets. Because while Justin's testimony had centered around his own trauma and his own failure to speak, it also drew a map of something much bigger, the way fame can be used as a leash, how power doesn't always look like violence, it often looks like favors, access, threats wrapped in gifts, loyalty bought through fear. Reporters outside couldn't write fast enough. Phones buzzed like alarm bells across the entertainment world. Inside label offices, executives were locking doors and holding emergency calls, unsure how deep the rot went. Publicists issued carefully crafted statements, shocked, heartbroken, standing with survivors, but the internet wasn't having it. Old clips began resurfacing online, Cassie flinching on live television, Diddy interrupting other artists with unsettling intensity, former collaborators suddenly disappearing from the spotlight after falling out of favor. Even interviews from a decade ago, ones that once seemed cryptic or confusing, now took on chilling clarity. One clip showed an old producer saying, "There are rooms you never want to be in. Rooms where stars go in and come out different." People now wondered, had Justin just described those very rooms? Had others seen too much? Were more names about to come forward? And even more haunting, how many never got out? As all this unraveled outside, the judge inside the courtroom called for a short recess, but no one moved. Jurors sat stunned. The prosecution team, usually laser-focused, just stared ahead in silence. And Diddy, once the loudest man in every room, couldn't even lift his head. Because it wasn't just that Justin had testified. It was what his testimony symbolized. A reversal of the script. A collapse of a dynasty built on silence. And maybe worst of all, a mirror held up to every artist who had looked away, every manager who had accepted the perks, every executive who had known but said nothing. Justin, through trembling voice and years of buried guilt, had done what entire teams of lawyers, journalists, and former associates had failed to do. He cracked the image. He exposed the illusion. And the truth, the real, grotesque, undeniable truth, was uglier than anyone had dared imagine. Inside the courtroom, an eerie calm settled. Cassie sat still, her eyes not fixed on Diddy, but on the judge, waiting. And when court resumed, prosecutors walked indifferently now, like the tide had turned and they could feel the momentum shift. The evidence clerk placed the USB on the table. A small, cold piece of metal, but inside it, hours of footage. Inside it, the moments Justin spoke of. Maybe worse. The judge addressed the court. Mr. Combs, your attorneys may review the submitted footage before it's entered as evidence. Diddy said nothing. Just nodded, barely. And then came the headlines. The internet exploded, hashtag justice for Cassie, hashtag we believe Justin, hashtag Diddy trial trended. Within minutes, celebrities began weighing in, some cautiously supportive, some shockingly silent. One tweet read, "Finally. Someone said what we all knew." Another, "I was at those parties. I saw too much." And then came the unfollowings, sponsors dropping Diddy's name, past collaborators scrubbing old posts. It was happening. The silence was shattering. And while many hoped to stay on the sidelines, the tide was now too strong. Justin's testimony had forced a reckoning, and the ripples of that choice were now crashing against the shores of an entire industry. Yet for Justin, this wasn't about headlines. It wasn't about redemption. That night, after leaving court, he didn't celebrate. He didn't post. He went home, to his wife, his child, and simply sat. No interviews. No cameras. Just quiet. And when asked later, days later, if he felt lighter, if speaking out had helped, his reply was simple: this wasn't about me feeling better. It was about finally doing what was right. And maybe that's the part that struck people most, not the drama, not the scandal, but the quiet dignity of someone who had once been a product of the machine choosing, at last, to break it from within. Because the truth isn't loud. It doesn't need fireworks. The truth, when it finally shows up, walks in calmly, speaks plainly, and changes everything. That's what Justin did. And nothing, absolutely nothing, will ever be the same again. But the thing about truth is, it doesn't knock politely. It crashes through the doors you thought were locked. And that's exactly what was happening now. The music industry, long protected by glamour and gatekeeping, was reeling. What Justin had done wasn't just brave, it was catalytic. One testimony had shattered years of built-up fear, and for the first time, people on the inside, real insiders, began whispering out loud. YouTube channels that once worshipped celebrity now turned into investigative platforms. TikTokers pulled up old interviews, paused frame by frame to point out bruises, odd expressions, interrupted body language, sidelong glances, details that had always been there, but dismissed as gossip. But now they hit differently. A silence that had stretched over decades was cracking like glass, and the people who once kept their heads down started to ask themselves, if Justin can do it, why can't I? Former stylists, backup dancers, producers' names, not known to the public, began emailing reporters. Old assistants who had signed NDAs were quietly consulting lawyers. What Justin had said about the industry being a machine of control, of unspoken coercion, it was resonating everywhere. But while the internet burned with reactions, hashtags, and speculations, inside the courtroom, things were taking an even more serious turn. The judge, known for his strict demeanor, looked visibly moved during playback of the USB footage. It wasn't just surveillance, it was systemic surveillance. Each file time-stamped, neatly labeled, with names. Some footage showed A-list celebrities, visibly intoxicated, guided through hallways by Diddy's security. Some clips showed heated arguments, muffled cries behind closed doors. But the worst weren't the parties, they were the quiet moments. Moments where Cassie sat on a couch alone, shoulders hunched, staring ahead like she was trying to disappear. Moments where Diddy entered a room and everyone visibly shifted, posture changed, eyes lowered. You could see it. Fear. Control. And the jury saw it too. Some jurors turned their eyes away. One wiped tears. The courtroom had gone from tense to haunted. This wasn't spectacle anymore, it was exposure. It wasn't just about Diddy, it was about what Diddy represented. A culture that rewarded silence. That punished truth. That offered luxury on the surface but demanded your soul underneath. And yet, in all this, Justin remained silent outside the courtroom. He didn't speak to press. Didn't issue a follow-up statement. Because he didn't have to. His actions had already opened the door, and now others were walking through it. Cassie, too, stayed quiet. But she didn't have to explain herself. Anymore. Not after the footage. Not after Justin's voice cracked while describing the moment he handed her his number and told her, "If you ever need help, call me." And the most haunting part? She never did. Because like so many, she believed there was no way out. Now, reporters started digging. More footage surfaced, some not even from Diddy's team. Hotel staff began coming forward anonymously. A bartender from an award show party said she was told to mix drinks stronger for certain guests and weaker for others. A former chauffeur recounted picking up crying women and being told to mind his own. And all the while, the silence from other stars, those who had once praised Diddy in interviews, grew louder. Some deleted posts. Others unfollowed. A few released short statements about needing time to reflect. But for the public, the damage was done. They had watched a man weep in court, not because he was innocent, but because he had finally lost control. And they had watched another man, still young, still famous, choose truth over safety. Choose justice over legacy. For Justin, it wasn't about attention. It wasn't even about clearing his own name. It was about lifting the weight. A weight he had carried for years. Nights he couldn't sleep. Songs he couldn't sing without remembering. People he had smiled beside even when his stomach twisted with guilt. This wasn't redemption. This was release. And that release gave others permission to stop pretending. Quietly, behind the scenes, other artists started contacting legal teams. One pop star, still active in the charts, was reportedly preparing her own statement. A backup dancer who had worked with Diddy in 2014 said she had video, texts, messages, proof. The prosecution now had more evidence than they had expected. And the defense? They were scrambling. Diddy's lead attorney filed multiple motions, some to suppress new footage, others to disqualify testimony. But it was too late. The story was out. The silence was over. And Diddy? The man who once walked into rooms with an army of handlers and an air of untouchable royalty now sat hunched at the defense table like a man waiting to be sentenced not just by a judge, but by history. Because this wasn't just a court case anymore. This was a cultural shift. A reckoning. And it was only getting started. And while the courtroom simmered in a thick silence that felt more like grief than judgment, the world outside kept accelerating. Major record labels began scrubbing mentions of past affiliations. Distribution companies paused campaigns. Press kits were quietly revised to omit Diddy's production credits. And beneath it all, the artists who once owed their fame to the empire he built were staring down a decision that could define the rest of their careers: speak up or be remembered as silent collaborators. The quiet clicks of unfollow buttons became digital screams. Influencers began refusing to use his music. Sports teams pulled his tracks from halftime shows. Morning talk shows that once gushed over his lavish lifestyle now sat around somberly discussing institutional abuse. Diddy's name was no longer followed by mogul, but by accused, disgraced, fallen. But the consequences? weren't only legal or professional, they were spiritual. People across social media began sharing personal reflections. "I grew up with his music," some posted. "But now I can't hear it the same way." Fans started questioning their own nostalgia. What had they ignored? What had they excused? It was as if the collective fog of entertainment illusion had lifted, and underneath lay something darker, more complicated. But even amid all that noise, one truth rang louder than the rest: Justin Bieber had changed everything. He hadn't just testified. He had detonated a wall that had stood for decades. His voice, as steady, trembling, then firm, had done what money, power, and fear couldn't prevent. And now the trial had entered a new phase. Prosecutors began reorganizing their case. With Bieber's timeline, they now had dates, locations, emotional context, and, most importantly, validation. Justin hadn't just confirmed Cassie's allegations. He had expanded them. He gave voice to the invisible threads of coercion that ran beneath every public appearance and private gathering. And more than that, he'd humanized them. His words made jurors feel the fear, the doubt, the cost of staying quiet. The jury instructions would soon include new pieces of evidence, thanks to the USB. And yet, strangely, the most powerful evidence wasn't video or audio, it was behavior. The way Diddy slumped lower with each revelation. The way he now looked at the floor instead of the judge. The way his attorneys began whispering urgently between themselves, papers flying, laptops closed. In a panic. Because they weren't just fighting legal charges anymore, they were watching the death of a legacy. And no verdict could undo that. But here's the paradox of power: the higher it builds, the harder it collapses. And this collapse was visible. Paparazzi captured him exiting the courtroom days later, surrounded by a skeleton crew of assistants, no longer commanding cameras, but avoiding them. The crowd didn't cheer or boo, they just watched. Because they knew they were witnessing the moment a titan became mortal. And meanwhile, inside homes across the country, people watched Justin's testimony on replay, some in disbelief, others in awe, many in tears. Parents watched and remembered buying Bieber's early albums for their kids. Teachers recalled playing his music at school events. But now, they saw him not as an idol, but as a man, one who had walked through fire and emerged, not untouched, but unashamed. And Justin? He didn't vanish. He didn't go silent. But he also didn't boast. He released no song. He posted no tweet. What he did, instead, was live. Quietly. Calmly. And in doing so, he showed a generation that healing doesn't come from likes or headlines, it comes from truth. A slow, painful, unglamorous kind of truth. And in that courtroom, his words still echoed. Not because they were loud, but because they were real. Because when someone finally tells the truth in a room full of people who've lived by lies, the silence that follows is sacred. The kind of silence that demands change. And that's what this trial had become. Not just a trial of a man, but of an entire culture. A cross-examination of the industry. Of how we crown kings. Of how we confuse charisma for character. And perhaps, most painful of all, how long we let the wrong people sit on thrones made from broken voices. Justin didn't say it all in one day. But what he did say was enough. Enough to wake people up. Enough to break the cycle. Enough to plant a seed. And that seed was growing. Everywhere.